Hollywood to white? Asian representation in Hollywood films.
Cinema, movie, film, whatever you call it, is one of the best things to experience in life since it has a significant influence in our society. As a cinephile, the beauty of cinema in itself is actually what made me fall in love with it. Growing up in a household that consumes both local and international media, I've become aware of how problematic the industry is when talking about representation. It is shocking how people of color, particularly Asians, are generally unseen in Hollywood films. Many of these films actually distort reality and show rather simplistic pictures of the world. It is exemplified in how Asians are constantly subjected to underrepresentation and unfair stereotyping from the 20th century up to the present. Now, with the recent increase in Asian diversity in Hollywood, it seems like a good time to ask, is there a genuine Asian representation in films? Asian is an enormous and complicated identity that includes multiple ethnicities. So, in this speech, I will primarily focus on East Asian topics as it is a more feasible scope when discussing Asian representation in general. Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee, Michelle Yeoh, most of us would think that prominent Asian figures like them in the most significant film industry in the world paved the way for more inclusive Asian roles in Hollywood. However, in retrospect, Asian roles seem to follow a pattern. These are almost always anchored on stereotypes. You might wonder how these stereotypes came about. Were these rooted in hate, racism, prejudice? Well, all of these are factors. As quoted by Panay from Wang, in the early 20th century, the West was not hugely exposed to the East. Thus, the way to generalize Eastern people was to build characters of an extreme. This led to the exaggeration of their depiction of the Asian life and culture. Moreover, historical events such as the rise of Yellow Peril, the metaphor that misrepresents Asians as threats or danger to the West, and the early Asian immigration in America have significantly influenced American perceptions and attitudes towards us. Of course, it has penetrated the media, eventually reaching the film industry, which is evidenced by the creation of stereotypes to other Asians. Films often box them into stereotypical roles, which hindered them from telling Asian stories through their acting. Examples of this are the roles of Asian women, which were always rooted in racial prejudice, sexism, and misogyny, such as the Dragon Lady and Lotus Blossom roles. The Dragon Lady role, which is the embodiment of white fear of Asians, portray them as sexy and wicked villains. On the other hand, the Lotus Blossom role showed them as China dolls, which are, I quote, utterly feminine and delicate, who attend to the needs of white men. On the other hand, some films portray Asian men as sexually inadequate, effeminate, or even asexual. An example of this is Jackie Chan in the 2001 film Rush Hour 2, where he plays a respectful but ignorant kung fu master who has no interest in sex. Sometimes they are also portrayed as sexual threats to white women. Hoppenstand stated that this threat posed by Asian male symbolizes the danger of the rape of white society. This is the yellow peril metaphor that I was talking about earlier. Aside from those mentioned, some Asian ethnicities also have stereotypes associated with them, such as terrorists or oil tycoons for Middle Easterns, or exotic people with tacky accents for Indians. Moreover, Asians are boxed into an othered role, portraying them as passive outsiders without dimension. This is rooted in the theory of Orientalism by Edward Said, which views Asians as something requiring of study, fundamentally different from the West, and in need of domination. These stereotypical portrayals and othering of Asians in Hollywood films imply that we are not worthy of the same treatment and stories as whites. Misrepresentation hinders us from showing that we are capable and multidimensional. Ultimately, it has affected the perceptions of Asians outside the media, causing detrimental consequences to their culture and social life. For example, a stereotype shown in a film may impact the self esteem of an Asian kid watching. It may cause a feeling of isolation and insecurity when in a room full of foreigners. When there is a lack of interaction between cultures, People tend to rely on stereotypes shown in media and film to formulate ideas of people of different races. Thus, these stereotypes actually are harmful and negatively impact the Asian society. Moreover, I have observed that Asians were rarely in leading roles from watching early Hollywood films. Some of them are in supporting roles, most probably for comic relief, but usually they were unseen, like purposely erased. Hollywood's prejudice against Asians has also resulted in the erasure of Asian actors from spotlight. Despite the availability of Asian actors, Asian roles would often go to white people, using an exaggerated yellow face makeup that distorted their features to make them look more Asian. An example of this is the 1937 film adaptation of Pearl S. Buck's novel The Good Earth, wherein the Chinese lead character, Olan, was played by white actress Louise Rayner. According to Liu, she beat Anime Wang, the most popular Asian film star during her time, even though the role was supposedly hers to lose since she was Chinese. This decision was related to the Hollywood Production Code's anti-miscegenation clause, which prohibited interracial romance on screen. They chose Rainier to play the yellow face, where they transformed the actress predominantly on her eyes. Despite that gross misrepresentation, Rainier won the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1938. Liu said that, I quote, Rainier was awarded for portraying an Oriental, a race that was invented by the American popular culture. You might think that yellowface was a 1930s thing, but you're mistaken. Scarlett Johansson, Emma Stone, and some actors in the 2012 film Cloud Atlas also portrayed Asian roles. Aside from yellowface, Asian actors are also indiscriminately cast into any Asian roles. An example of this is when Jackie Chan portrayed a Japanese character as a stuntman in the 1973 film Enter the Dragon. Here we can see that Hollywood only cares about the money and looks, not accuracy or representation. It has created the idea that Asian identity is homogeneous when multiple subsections of the continent have their own stories and struggles. It promotes a skewed and distorted image of Asians and Asian Americans, which hinders true Asian representation in Hollywood. I cannot explain this further without mentioning the Academy Awards, which is the most prestigious awards body in the film industry. Some Asians have been awarded an Oscar, lately Bong Joon-ho for Parasite and Chloe Zhao for Nomadland. However, there seems to be a lack of recognition of Asian acting performances. So far, only two men have won an acting Oscar, Ben Kingsley in 1982 and Hang Ngor in 1984. For actresses, unfortunately, there are also two. Miyoshi Umeki in 1957, who won for her performance as a lotus blossom in her movie, and just last year, Yo Jong Yoon for her amazing performance in Minari. Although films with Asian casts generally perform well at the Oscars, as evidenced by the Oscar wins of Slumdog Millionaire and Parasite, individual acting performances are often overlooked. Asian actors are recognized when white actors such as Aileen McMahon, Jennifer Jones, and Gail Sondergaard were nominated for portraying an Asian character. This nonsense speaks volumes about underrepresentation and erasure of Asian actors. Yes, Asian films are recognized, but how about the acting performances that serve as the faces of representation? Some of these performances are a reflection of ourselves and our culture, thus, they also deserve recognition. Now, let's look at the current state of the Hollywood film industry. According to the Gina Davis Institute on Gender in Media in 2021, only 4.5% of prominent cast members in movies were Asian and Pacific Islanders. Adding insult to injury, three-fourths of these characters were limited to supporting roles. Notice how we Asians are still marginalized and underrepresented in an industry that should embrace diverse cultures in this century. According to sociologist Nancy Wang Yuan, this treatment just speaks to the lack of authority that Asians have to be able to tell their own stories in Hollywood. Also, from the 329 Asian American actors surveyed by the said institute, 93% agreed that Asian representation on screen is inadequate. This just proves that there is no genuine Asian representation in Hollywood. Fictitious portrayals of Asians in films significantly impact how they are perceived by society, disabling them with proper and just representation, and by isolating them into these stereotypical roles, Hollywood just emphasizes that we are not worthy of the same treatment in stories as whites. We are not given the chance to show our true cultures and personalities. If we are perceived as those mentioned stereotypes, people will not see us as to how we truly are on and outside the screen. Pushing for Asian representation on screen is not just about fighting for roles, but also fighting for our own stories that show that we are like them, not adjacent, not other. So, what now? Racism and prejudice against Asians are systemic problems, but we could make a difference by being vocal about it and fighting for our proper representation. As discouraging as these stereotypes and the lack of representation could be, people are moving forward. Recently, the Media Action Network for Asian Americans, a group of Asian activists, is calling for the boycott of the 2021 film and Academy Award nominee Licorice Pizza for its casual racism through the use of mocking accent and an offensive joke that perpetuates the stereotype that all Asians are the same and interchangeable. Aside from this, we can now see more Asians as lead characters in movies, such as the all Asian cast of Crazy Rich Asians and lately Simu Liu in Shang-Chi, whose characters are not written based on stereotypes. These performances are crucial to increasing diversity in the film industry. Indeed, Hollywood is too wide. But as we move forward and fight for the treatment Asians deserve, the industry is gradually changing. You might wonder, what can we do as individuals? Well, we should watch, consume media critically, and continue to speak up against the marginalization of Asians in Hollywood. In the battle for representation, there is no perfect outcome, but fighting for a representation on the big screen is a bestowment of dignity as it demands the society to look at us, not past or through us. That's all. Thank you for listening.